Despite all of this, there is still room for long form content. And I mean, I guess it really depends on who your target listener is and how they consume information. So if your target listener is really active on social media and that's how they consume their podcasts, right? They don't really listen to them, but they'll play a clip on social media. Length doesn't really matter in that case, right? Because you can chop it up and spoon feed it. You could have an hour-long podcast and you can turn that into 10 different clips. Welcome back to Podcasting and Professional Services. If it's your first time here, my name is John Tyerman, founder of Red Cedar Marketing. If you love hearing from successful podcast hosts in industries like accounting, AEC, consulting, technology, then you're in the right place. This episode is meant to be a guide for podcasters who want to learn more about how to structure their episodes, how to use different episode types, formats, how to improve their outlines, that kind of thing. I'll share my own experience as well as I've curated some clips from some of my previous podcast hosts talking about the different episode types that they use. And I've also included some clips from another podcast that I host called Breaking Biz Dev. More about that later. Before we get started, let's launch a podcast together. I'm offering a free podcast consultation for listeners of this podcast. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Shoot me a direct message saying you'd like to take me up on my podcast offer. We'll schedule some time to talk about what a podcast would look like for you. Should you have a co-host? Should it be an interview series? Many of the things that we're going to cover on this episode, we'll go over with you in that consultation for your specific scenario. So reach out to me on LinkedIn, reach out to me on Twitter. Would love to have a conversation. All right, let's get into today's episode. If you're a reader, I'm going to repurpose this episode into a blog post on redcedarmarketing.com. So if you prefer to dig a layer deeper into the topic, maybe reference some of the examples that I mentioned, check out redcedarmarketing.com, go up to the top, go to the resources tab, go down to the blog, and you'll see blog posts for all of my podcast episodes there. So check that out. All right, let's start with your podcast episode format and typology. When it comes to podcasting, there are no rules, which makes it really fun. You know, it's an art form. But in my experience, what I've noticed is that there's different types of episodes. There's different ways that these hosts structure their episodes. So whether you're a solo host or whether you run a podcast with a co-host, there's different episode typologies or there's different episode types underneath of that. So let's start with podcasts that have a solo host. Now, recently I took a sample of 105 different podcasts across AEC, accounting, and law firms. And what I found was about 70%, a little more than 70% of those podcasts have a solo host, and about 28% around there have multiple hosts. So the majority of the podcasts have one host, but there are some that have co-hosts, and that's gaining popularity. I'll have another episode about that coming up in the next couple weeks. But let's start with podcasts that have a solo host, right? Okay, so what are the different podcast episode formats or types underneath a podcast with a solo host? Well, first of all, you can do a solo cast or a monologue. So this is when one host records a monologue about a certain topic. There are many different ways that you can record a monologue. It can be a short little episode. It can be a longer episode. Recently, I interviewed Ross Simmons on the podcast. He hosts a podcast called Create Like the Greats. He has a monologue type of episode. It's different than the interview types that he does as well on his podcast. I've grabbed a clip from that conversation and I'll place it right here. So here comes Ross.
So one of our formats is probably about an hour-long episode where it's a monologue, where I take people into the data, the background, the history of how some of these organizations were created, founded, how they grew. We dive deep into data around like their organic growth, how much traffic they're generating, how much sales they're generating. And I was ridiculously surprised by how much time it takes to create those types of episodes. I thought I could turn on a camera, turn on a microphone and record, and it would be done very quickly. But there's a lot of takes. There's a lot of edits. There's a lot of research that goes into it. There's a lot of script writing. You can't just say, ChatGPT, write this script for me. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And I did not know that it would take as much time as it actually does.
All right. So that was interesting, Ross's perspective about how he didn't really anticipate how much research would go into those monologues. So if you're a podcaster and you're thinking about that as an episode type, it might take a few times for you to truly understand the prep work that you need to create a good episode. All right. Another episode type underneath of a solo host would be the classic one-to-one interview style podcast. So this is one that many shows use. I'll give an example. Recently, I talked with Michael Zapersky from the Consulting Success podcast, which is on track to publish 400 episodes in 2024. And that's a classic style with, you know exactly what you're going to expect. He interviews guests that are a few steps ahead of his target audience, which makes his podcast appeal to his target audience. Go back and check out that episode with Michael Zapersky. I think you'll really like it. All right. Another episode type, if you're a solo host, panel discussions. So this is where one podcast host moderates a panel of experts. This is really, really great if your podcast host also hosts your company webinars. This is what I did when I was director of marketing at Silverback Strategies, which is a digital marketing agency out of Washington, D.C. And we held webinars where we had a panel of experts, and we talked about different topics like data privacy, how to calculate return on marketing spend. And then we repurposed those webinar recordings into podcast episodes. So that's just another example of a different episode type that you can use with a solo host. Another thing is you could mix these episode types up, right? So an example of a hybrid episode would be this one, the one that you're listening to right now. So this is a mix of both monologues and clips from other podcasts. So you've got a little bit of mixed media in there. So I've done this hybrid episode type a few times, and it does require a little bit more production work on the front end, but it helps when you have a library of content like I do with my one-on-one interviews that I do. So those are the different types that you could do as a solo host. Now, where it really gets interesting is where you look at the different episode types that you can have with a co-host. So I'll give you a couple examples. You can still have that one-to-one interview type with a co-host. The catch is the co-hosts actually interview each other so that you take turns interviewing each other. I'll give you an example. Two Bobs is a podcast that's widely known in the business community with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. And they take turns interviewing each other about different topics. Recently, David interviewed Blair about why salespeople just need to shut up in sales meetings. Just stop talking. So that was a really great episode. Go check that out. I'm going to use that as an example on the blog post, so you can check out the link there. Another episode type with co-hosts. This is one that I call yin and yang. The conversation is very balanced. It's not dominated by one person or another. There's a healthy back and forth that goes on. It's not quite an interview, but it's more of a conversation. Some examples of this: The Business of Architecture. Enoch and Ryan, they do a very good job at this, and where there's some discourse, and they're experimenting with this as an episode type. That show has historically been more of an interview series, but they're exploring with different episode types. I interviewed Ryan Willard, who is one of the co-hosts on that podcast a few episodes ago. And this was one thing that he explained, where doing that together gives them a lot more flexibility in terms of scheduling, but then it creates an environment where they can be a little bit more provocative with the topics that they talk about and how they talk about them. So that's another episode type that you can use if you have a podcast that has co-hosts. Another one is a group interview. This is where multiple co-hosts interview a guest. And I'll give you an example. Recently, Max and Zach from the Structural engineering podcast interviewed Mark Wainwright, where the subject was how over the course of an engineer's career, their contribution to business development looks different at different points in that career. And so it was a very interesting episode. I recommend you go check that out. It's linked in the blog post associated with this episode. But I thought that was a really, really great topic. And Max and Zach do a great job at balancing the interview. Speaking of Mark Wainwright, he and I co-host the Breaking BizDev podcast, where we break down, beat up, and redefine business development for professional services firms. And we've got a couple different episode types that we really like. And one of them is called a teardown. And so this is where we roast a topic. And recently, Mark and I did an episode called Disastrous Job Descriptions, where he and I independently went out and looked at job descriptions for business development managers in professional services firms. And what we wanted to tear down is in each of these job descriptions, it's not hard to find. It's really easy to go out and find these. They throw everything in the kitchen sink in there. You know, you're responsible for building marketing budgets. You're responsible for doing the marketing, for generating leads, for closing the deals, for seeing the projects through, and for managing the client down the road. So they're looking for unicorns, and that's exactly what we wanted to tear down. And so I'll give you just a short little clip from one of those episodes so you can get a feel for that kind of episode type. All right, here comes Mark and I talking about a disastrous job description.
So not only are you marketing, generating leads, but you're closing the business, you're developing proposals, you're seeing the project through.
Yeah. In a 500-person firm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
We're going to end with a bang here. So the very last line in this job description is the business development manager may be asked to perform other duties required to accomplish the goals of the sector program or the corporate business plan. So not only is it just the sector, but now they've broadened the scope to the whole entire business.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, and by the way, if we forgot about anything, it's your responsibility too.
All right, another episode type that Mark and I played around with was a listicle. And so we have an episode called 10 Ways to Suck at Events and Conferences. And so this is essentially coming kind of from the opposite point of view. Is like, if you want to like fail at going to in-person events and going to conferences and using that as part of your business development strategy, if you want to suck at that, then do these things. It's kind of comical, but I thought it was really fun, but it just kind of shows you how you can kind of go and list things off and have it structure your podcast in a list format. And that creates structure for the listener. So here's a clip where he and I just right out of the gate did a rapid fire, 10 things. We went back and forth. I did 5, he did 5. And then from there, we launched into, okay, well, here's what you can do about it. So here's 10 ways to suck at events and conferences.
Why don't you lead us off, and then we'll do rapid fire through different ways you can suck.
Both of us came up with many more than this because there's a whole lot of ways to suck at this whole thing. I'll lead off. And these are in no order of suck. They're all bad. All right. So first on my list, John, just show up. You do no planning, no preparation, whatever else. And you just think my charisma and my personality are going to carry the day. I'm just going to show up.
Never, ever research the audience who's going to be at the event. Right? Yep. You don't want to know anything about them because you want to be surprised.
Right. Surprise is good in business. Have your company write a big check for a sponsorship and then just send a couple of random people to quote network. Fantastic way to blow it.
Don't build up any anticipation with your network at all. Don't mention that you're going to the event.
Yeah. It should be a secret. Don't set any goals, right? Your expectations should be completely zero, and maybe you have a pleasant lunch with somebody and you think, oh, that's a total win, right? No goals. No.
Don't look up social posts from people who post at the event. Don't engage with them at all.
Getting some real-time information about, people's impression.
Starting
of the
conversations. I mean, who wants to do that?
Exactly. Starting conversations on social media, and if staying in touch with the pulse of the event. Yeah, don't. Yeah. Don't do that. John, this is getting ugly. All right. Never, ever attempt to speak or present at a conference.
Yeah, right? You don't want to do that. Too much attention on yourself.
Yeah. Just think of all the attention that the people on the stage are getting. You're going to be just fine sitting in the back of the room in that chair you managed to get yourself into. So just stay put.
You don't want to have your marketing team back at the office. You don't want them to support you in any way. You need to do this on your own.
Why would you leverage that very valuable resource that you have at your organization to help promote, your participation in the event? What? Do absolutely zero pre-event outreach or post-event follow-up.
The event is a single point in time.
It's a lot of work. It's probably not going to lead to anything, so just blow it off.
And if you really want to suck at events and conferences, don't record any audio, don't take any photos, don't do any videos, don't create any content from the event. Just don't do it. So if you want to suck at events and conferences, follow those 10 points of advice.
Right. And if you want to keep sucking, just stop right now. Right. Just press stop on the podcast and take all that valuable insight that we just shared with you and just use that.
Yep.
But if you want to actually improve and leverage the power of events and conferences and other types of important marketing activities, maybe you should listen to what comes next.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as Mark and I did when we recorded it. That was a lot of fun. He and I like to experiment with different kinds of episode types. So tune into Breaking Biz Dev if you like what you hear. In a few weeks, we're going to release a hybrid episode or hybrid episode type where it's called What's Broken in Business Development. And we independently went out and interviewed some folks about what they think is broken in business development. And then we've kind of stitched it together into an episode. And so depending on when you're listening to this, it might be available. Go follow the show. Check out some of those episodes. If you're into professional services, you're likely going to like Breaking Biz Dev. So go check that out. All right. So now that we talked about episode types, let's move into how to outline a podcast episode. And so in this section, we're going to talk about topic identification, guest selection, and the different elements of a podcast episode. So those are the things that we're going to talk about now. So let's start with topic identification and guest selection. So this is where it's really, really important to have a content calendar for your podcast. I use Monday.com. It's great. That's where I use to keep all my content organized. It's just me and my business. I'm a solopreneur. And so I use the podcast to fuel the blog, to fuel the newsletter, to fuel LinkedIn, to fuel Twitter. And so I rely on systems and technology to make the overhead low. And so Monday.com really helps with that. Couldn't recommend it enough. And so there I have a content calendar, and that helps me zoom out and so I can look at the topics of each episode in relation to the other episodes that I have in my catalog. With Breaking Biz Dev, Mark and I tend to kind of zoom in and zoom out on that calendar. And then we also think about, okay, well, seasonality. What are professional services firms from a business perspective? What's the season of their business, right? So you can think about Q4 is normally this planning period where marketing investments kind of throttle back. People are having holiday parties. They're investing in their people. I've noticed an uptick in kind of Q1 in my time in the agency world. That's where a lot of businesses like to invest. And then there's different points along the year that have different significance. Like Q2 is conference season, for example. So we take that into consideration when we plan out our podcast episodes. Another tool that you can use to help identify topics to talk about is to brainstorm. And so if you've got a co-host, this is really, really one of the biggest benefits of having a co-host is you can brainstorm those topics and bounce ideas off of each other. You can use ChatGPT. It's pretty good at generating a big, long list of topics that you can then use your own filter to kind of go through and strike some out, and maybe you'll find one. You're kind of like panning for gold a little bit, but it does work. What I found to be successful is that if you're on social media, if you're on LinkedIn, to keep a swipe file. And so this is just a folder on your desktop where if you see something, they'd say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I could talk about that. Throw it into the swipe file and then save it for later. And then when you're ready to sit down and ideate and brainstorm about topics, go to that swipe file and check out what you saved over the last few weeks. And you might say, oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, definitely. And that might jog your memory and you might say, okay, let's add this topic to the list. Or better yet, let's add this topic to my content calendar. And then from there, once you have those topics, you do your research. And so this is where if you're an interview style show, this is kind of guest research, guest selection. If you're not and you're looking at different topics, this is where you can do keyword research. You can go and look at the search engine results page and click on different articles that around that topic and then get a sense of what's there, what's missing, what's the unique perspective that you can add. If you're in an interview series, let's talk about guest selection for a little bit. Let's talk about guest research. So obviously you want to consider your audience first and foremost and whether or not your guest is going to add value to that audience. And so that's just kind of bar none, right? So for example, on this podcast, when I do have guests, I try to get guests that are a few steps ahead of not only where I am right now, but where my target audience is. Once you have a surface level understanding, you go to their LinkedIn profile, you see that they have a good following, you see that they post about the kinds of topics that you want to ask them about. They're an established authority in a certain niche that your audience cares about. The next step is you want to make sure that they're legit, right? And you want to get a feel for them. Well, have they interviewed on other podcasts before? If so, then you should absolutely listen to that and understand, hear their voice, right? For all of the guests that come on my podcast, I will go and I will listen to them talk on their own podcasts. Number one, it just helps me familiarize myself with their voice. And so that prepares me for my interview. And so how much energy do I need to bring? Do they bring a lot of energy, right? And so it's those kind of things. All right, let's talk about the different elements of a podcast episode. I'm going to start with the listener just hits play, and I'm going to talk about some different elements that you can include at different points along the way. So first, let's start with the cold open. So this is a short 20 to 30 second clip from a key moment in your podcast that plays at triple zeros. Right. So the listener hits play and this is the first thing they hear. And then after that cold open, the next element is an intro sequence. So this is, maybe there's background music and it swells up and there's either a pre-recorded intro or a live read introducing new and existing listeners to the podcast. I did a live read at the beginning of this podcast. I've experimented with pre-recorded intros as well. On Breaking Biz Dev, we had a voiceover actress record the intro for that show, and we use that at the beginning of each one of those shows. After the intro, I recommend an explanation of what the listener should expect in the episode. After that, a live read or a mid-roll. And so this is a place for you to plug your business or a sponsor up front while you have your audience is captivated. So if you'll recall, at the beginning of this episode, I did a live read where I offered a podcast consultation. So that was an example of a live read. It doesn't have to be super salesy, but it's a point where you can help build the awareness of the services that you offer. And so after you get the live read, then you can jump into the main content, why your listeners showed up in the first place. Ideally, that happens within the first 5 minutes of your podcast. Otherwise, you're You're dragging it out too long. Listeners don't like that. After you talk about the main content, I like to say end your podcast with authority. Ask guests where listeners can find them. Thank them for their time. Until next time, there should be a feeling of, okay, we are wrapping up this conversation. And then after that, you can have an outro. And so I like to think about this as a final message to listeners. This could be pre-recorded. You could recap a plug for your business or a sponsor. You could say, hey, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe if you made it this far. One of my favorite podcasters, it's a sports podcast. At the end of the podcast, he says, if you made it this far, I owe you a beer. And then he has in-person events where he buys everyone beers. So it's really cool. All right. So next we're going to talk about video versus audio podcasts. Real quick, a couple pros and cons for whether you should do an audio or video podcast. All right. So let's start with just an audio podcast. So some of the pros for doing just an audio podcast are it simplifies operations. It's easier. You don't need any cameras. You just need mics, right? And so that simplifies things a bit. Another pro for just audio podcasts is you can still use video in your promotions with audiograms. And so that's a static image with captions overlaid on top. Maybe you've got some background music, but then you have an audio file in there. So, and then you use that to create a video asset that you can use on social media. So you can still have video promotion of your audio podcast. Some cons of doing just an audio podcast. Those video clips are faceless, right? On social media, you're essentially limiting yourself. You're also limiting your distribution power, essentially. All right, so let's talk about some of the pros of a video podcast. It builds trust and familiarity better with your audience, right? They see your face. They see you talking. They hear your voice. They see your voice and your face together on a screen. With a video podcast, you've got more distribution power. You can take your episodes and you can upload them to YouTube where people can watch you. They can watch the episodes. So you've got flexibility with visuals that you can bring on screen, right? And so that gives you a little bit more flexibility that way. Some of the cons of a video podcast, it increases the operational complexity. So if you want to do video, that's another element that needs to be managed, that needs to be produced, right? And so there's different tools that you might need to use, and there's different skill sets that you need to use on your podcast team. There's also personal sensitivity to video. There are guests that I've had on my show that don't like being on video. And you, as a host of a video podcast, you've got to navigate that, right? There are some hosts that don't like to be on video. So that's absolutely something that should be taken into consideration when structuring your podcast and thinking about, should this be an audio podcast or a video podcast? Or should this be an audio episode and a video episode? Like, for example, this is an audio episode of a primarily video podcast. So like I said, there's no rules in podcasting. So, all right, let's talk about ideal podcast episode length. And I'm going to lead with this. The average commute in the United States is 25 minutes. So do with that what you will, right? Based on my own experience as a podcast listener who listens mostly in the car, and from analyzing my own podcast data, listenership drops after 20 minutes. And I'm not alone in this. In fact, recently I interviewed Angela Mazzi from the Architecting podcast, and she had a similar experience. Here comes Angela.
I've noticed just a little tip with podcasting is never hit stop, just talk, because you can always edit it later. And if you stop, you lose the flow of your thinking. So I really do just get on there and talk. And I shoot for about 20 to 30-minute episodes because I find that's about the length of time most people care to listen. Longer, they tend to drop off if you look at the listen rates. So I do the episodes about that length of time. And I've done it enough now that I have a sense of how long that really is to talk. And I will say it takes twice as long to edit as it does to record, sometimes more, because you got to keep listening and going back and filtering and maybe taking something out or saying, oh, I wanted to link those 2 points. So then you go record another sentence and stick it in the middle. But that's really been my process. And I know a lot of people will outsource editing. I couldn't imagine doing that because I don't know how somebody else would know what I really want to get across. So I love doing my own editing.
All right. So I'm glad I'm not alone in the 20 to 30 minute kind of sweet spot there. It seems like that is the sweet spot that, as podcasters, if you want to optimize for that commute time, that would be a great episode length to shoot for. Now, despite all of this, there is still room for long form content. And I mean, I guess it really depends on who your target listener is and how they consume information. So if your target listener is really active on social media and that's how they consume their podcasts, right? They don't really listen to them, but they'll play a clip on social media. Length doesn't really matter in that case, right? Because you can chop it up and spoon feed it. You could have an hour-long podcast and you can turn that into 10 different clips, right? Does your target audience commute a lot? Maybe you target a certain geographic location or a city that is a big commuter city, right? And so under 30 minutes would be ideal. Match your podcast length to that average commute stat. Does your target audience like to exercise a lot? Maybe keep it under 30 minutes, 20-minute exercises, right? Do they do chores while they listen? I know I'm out mowing the lawn for like 45 minutes and I listen to podcasts while I do that. So long form may work for in that scenario. Folks don't usually listen while they work. Some folks do. So, that could be kind of a coin flip, but long form may work in that situation. Again, it all depends on who your audience is and how they consume information. So once you know that, that'll help you understand how long your podcast episodes should be. All right, so I'm going to give you some examples of podcasts in professional services that are both short, medium, and long. So I define short podcasts as under 20 minutes. My friend Dan Blum, he recently launched a podcast called HOA Law Nerds. And they're having a ton of fun with that. It's a co-hosted show. Episodes are under 20 minutes. An example of kind of this medium, this sweet spot length, this 20 to 35 minutes, Inspiring People and Places with BJ Kramer is a great example of this. So his episodes are, between 20 and 45 minutes, mostly in that 20 to 35 minute range, that 30-minute range. Breaking Biz Dev, Mark and I like to keep our episodes in that sweet spot for all the reasons I mentioned above. And there are absolutely established podcasts that run long form content. The Accounting Podcast with Blake Oliver, the 99% Invisible Podcast with Roman Mars, Business of Architecture, I mentioned that earlier with Enoch Sears and Ryan Willard. Though all of those podcasts run long form content, 45 minutes, an hour long, sometimes an hour and a half long. So there is absolutely room for any kind of episode length. It really depends on your listeners and how you want to position your show. All right. So that is it for this podcast episode guide. To wrap up, I just want to wrap up with some key points. Number one, there's a wide range of podcast episode formats and types, and they can be different depending on if you have one host or co-hosts. Number two, a lot goes into topic or guest selection and research. Number three, understanding the elements of a podcast episode can help build awareness of your services. Number four, there are different pros and cons to structuring your podcast as audio only or audio and video. And then number five, the ideal length of a podcast depends on who your listener is and how they consume information. All right. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podcasting in Professional Services. I'm John Tyerman. If you enjoyed this episode, please give the show a rating and a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether it's Apple or Spotify, and shoot me a note on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Did you like this episode? Did you hate this episode? Would love to hear that too. And if you want to launch a podcast, reach out to me for a free consultation. Happy podcasting.